Okay, let's do this thing. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you. All right. It's great to have those of you who are streaming with us. We thank you very much. Our streaming audience is getting larger and larger and larger. And if you're streaming with us and would like to be on our mailing list, we would love to hear from you. If any of you are in this room and you would like to be on our mailing list, we send an email blast every Thursday afternoon, Thursday morning, talking about what's coming up in this room and also in the worship room. And we have clipboards over here with green sheets of paper where you can give us your name and contact information. We also would love to have your money. All Saints Church operates on the Spirit and oxygen and the money too. So we would love for you to be a pledging member of All Saints Church. You don't have to kind of go through our membership class to be a member. All you have to do is pledge and bam, you're in. So all you have to do is tell that sister over there and she'll fix you up with a pledge card. Also available... before I sell books, at All Saints Church, we think that our worship needs action to be completed, and so we choose an action every week that has some consequence about political policy. Today, our action is about gun control and gun violence. I've written a letter to the president thanking him for his amazingly beautiful, wise, audacious leadership this past week. It spells out everything. So, I'd love for you to go to our action table. It's somewhere on the lawn, and please sign on to that. We want him to hear from us here at All Saints Church in the White House. There are red welcome bags at tables all over the place. If you're visiting, they contain information about All Saints. Please pick one up. It's for you. There are books for sale by our speaker today. Beyond Fundamentalism, outstanding, really magnificent. No God But God, international bestseller, really impactful book about understanding the relevance and the true Islam, and also the most recent bestseller about Jesus Zealot, the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. All three are available, and don't know if Reza will have a chance to stay and sign or not. Now, the most important and heartfelt thing I want to say about our speaker today is he is so wonderful. He is, he's just thrilling. He's a fantastic public intellectual, insightful, articulate, expressive, teaches writing, so that God knows his way around language, and by God is not afraid to use it, particularly when he's being interviewed on Fox News. And is having a few wrong-headed tete-a-tetes on CNN, Bill Maher, or any other place. And he is a soul friend of mine, a life friend of mine, and will always be a friend of mine, and he will always be a friend of this place. There's no doubt about it. You should know that he is the founder of Aslan Media, a fantastic website where you can go and keep posted on absolutely everything, a social media network for news and entertainment about the Middle East and the world, and co-founder and chief creative officer of Boomgen Studios, the premier entertainment brand for creative content from and about the greater Middle East. He's got an amazing new project that he may tell us something about, and I could go on and on and on because his CV is quite extensive and lengthy and impressive and inspiring. But that would cheat you and me out of hearing the wisdom, the pearls, and the transformative information coming to us today by our friend Reza Aslan. Please welcome him.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Ed. Thanks, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be here before you again. I think this is like my 6th time or something, and I love coming here. I love coming to this church. The good news is, I already told Ed this, the good news is that my family and I, they're over there. That's my wife and my boys. We're... Yay, Baba! Yay, Baba! That's actually how they greet me every day. That's how We're moving to Highland Park, so we're going to be coming here. Yeah. This will now be our church. Just in time. Just in time for Ed to retire. So perfect. Perfect timing. No, it's really great to be here. I also want to say a special hi. My brother-in-law is here, Adam Jackley. Hi, Adam. My brother-in-law is a pastor in Pittsburgh, and pretty much everything I know about preaching, I know from him. Thanks, everybody. Listen, I know that we in these kinds of forums, we have a very, very short amount of time, and my favorite part of these things are Q&As, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the fact that, it's that wonderful season again, that holiday, beautiful season, which we like to call election time. A time of fear-mongering and xenophobia and just all-around hatred of the other. It's a beautiful, beautiful time in America. And the thing is that it's funny because it's getting so progressively worse that we're just kind of getting used to it, like the whole frog in the boiling water experiment. I mean, I remember so clearly in 2012 when you had people like Newt Gingrich, for instance, promising that he, as president, would immediately push forward a constitutional amendment banning Islamic law in the United States, which is funny because we actually already have one of those. It's called the Constitution. And then, you had Herman Cain saying, he wouldn't allow any Muslims to serve on his cabinet because, during World War II, we wouldn't let Nazis serve in our cabinet, would we? Which is really hilarious, actually. And we all thought, oh my God, it's just so terrible. That kind of rhetoric is so terrible. Man, I miss those days. Man, those were such great days. Now you compare that to the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of the presidential frontrunners in the GOP, and it's appalling. And you all know exactly what I'm talking about, whether it's, Ben Carson talking about how, he would never support a Muslim for president, or whether it's Donald Trump. Sorry. I'm sorry. I just barfed a little bit in my mouth. I'm sorry. Talking about either remember how scandalized we were when he said he wants a national registry of Muslims, and we thought that's the worst thing a presidential candidate could possibly say. No. Turns out no. And then he went and called for a complete ban of Muslims, even American Muslims, but then he changed his mind after about a week or so. Actually, funny story, when he called for a ban of all Muslims, including American citizens, from entering the United States, I was in Haiti, and I thought, uh-oh, I guess I'm living here now. Which is fine, because interesting thing about Haiti is that they have inalienable constitutional rights, so it would have been okay. The thing about this, though, that I want to emphasize is that it's really easy to make fun of Donald Trump, and it's very easy to make fun of Ben Carson for this outrageous rhetoric, except that they are simply reflecting a mood that already exists, not just in the Republican Party, but in the United States in general. 40% of Republicans actually want a national registry of Muslims in the United States. Now that sounds outrageously high, except that 30% of all Americans would like Muslims to, at the very least, carry special IDs that identify them as Muslims. 30% is more than 100 million Americans who believe in a special ID for Muslims. 65% of Republicans agree with Donald Trump that there should be a ban of Muslims coming into the United States. 57% of Republicans believe that that a Muslim should be banned from running for president. And And then, of course, 43% of Republicans still believe that President Obama is a Muslim. It's unbelievable. There's nothing that this man could do. I used to say that before the previous election that the only way that you could ever possibly convince these guys that Obama isn't a Muslim is if he announced that Jesus Christ would be his running mate. And then occurred to me, then you're talking about a Muslim Jew ticket, and that's even worse. That's terrible. Now, obviously, the reason that there is such resonance for this kind of rhetoric it's clear, it's obvious. I mean, there's been sort of an enormous amount of fear of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and domestic terrorism, certainly in the wake of the Paris attacks and San Bernardino attacks. As a matter of fact, 49% of Americans, so nearly half of us, say that they are afraid of being a victim of terrorism. 49%, which is kind of a remarkable figure because you are more likely to be struck by lightning twice than to be a victim of terrorism. In fact, you are more likely to be shot by a toddler in the United States. You are more likely to be shot by a toddler in the United States than you are to be a victim of terrorism. You have a better chance of dying because of your faulty furniture. Your faulty furniture is more deadly than a terrorist to Americans. And yet, half of us have as a primary fear this fear of being a victim of terrorism. Now, I do think it's important to also understand what we mean when we say terrorism. I mean, this term, for most of us, has become kind of a useless term. I refer to it as a wastebasket term. It's one of those terms that says much more about the person using it than about the person being described. I mean, we know the polls, the figures speak for themselves. It's a big, splashy front-page New York Times article a couple of months ago that said that more than twice as many Americans have been killed as a result of right-wing and white supremacist terrorism in the United States than Islamic terrorism. Now, that number now has actually gotten smaller since the San Bernardino attack, but it is still a higher percentage of Americans, a higher number of Americans that have been killed since 2001, since the 9/11 attacks by right-wing terrorism than by Islamic terrorism. More importantly, that figure ignores the fact that how we define terrorism is completely subjective. So, for instance, when Bob Deere, the Planned Parenthood shooter, motivated by a clear religious ideology, shot up a Planned Parenthood clinic, that was not labeled by the FBI as terrorism. When Dylan Roof, a neo-Nazi white supremacist, clearly radicalized by an ideology, killed not just a group of black worshipers, but including government representatives, that was not classified by the FBI as terrorism. When Michael Wade Page, another neo-Nazi, walked into a Sikh temple, confusing them for Muslims, which is a whole other issue. The number of Sikhs that have been attacked over the last couple of years by white supremacists because they just assume they're Muslims because they're wearing a turban is outrageous. When he went in and shot up a Sikh temple, again, the FBI did not categorize that as terrorism. When Joseph Stack, an anti-government activist who left a 140-page manifesto saying that the only response to government tyranny is violence, flew an airplane into an IRS building, killing a government official, that was not classified by the FBI as terrorism. When Jared and Amanda Miller, the anti-government fanatics in Las Vegas, went on a shooting spree, killing, I believe, 3 or 4 police officers. They actually left "Don't Tread on Me" flags on their corpses. That was not classified as terrorism. when Pastor Bob Duggart, you know who I'm talking about here? The Tennessee pastor who was recently arrested because he had stockpiled weapons and put together a very sophisticated plan to go to a small town in upstate New York and to, in his words, kill men, women, and children, Muslim men, women, and children. He was not only not charged with terrorism, he was arrested and then charged with making an interstate threat. He is now at home watching football. He's now just sitting around in his living room. He's not even in prison. So not only is this notion of terrorism absolutely overblown, not only is our focus of where the true threat of terrorism lies completely misguided, but how we even think about terrorism itself has become absolutely bogged down and confused by these various ideologies that in many ways are part of how we identify ourselves as a nation. It's part of our national consciousness. Now, none of this belies the fact that there is a very real, undeniable problem of global terror at the hands of these radical jihadist groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, or two of the main ones, but there are certainly many, many more. And I think that the problem with the conversations that we're having is that they so quickly become polarized, right? That you immediately pick a side and then you forget about all the gray areas that are, where the real issue is at hand. And so you have on the one side people who will say, well, this kind of terrorism, ISIS, has nothing to do with Islam whatsoever. It is not Islamic. The president, of course, says this quite frequently, and he gets an enormous amount of criticism for doing so, that no matter what he does, no matter what actions he takes, no matter how hard he fights against ISIS or against terrorism, because he refuses to simply refer to it as Islamic terrorism, then he's not really taking it seriously, which is hilarious. But this is something that somebody else once said, is that, it's almost as though the Republicans think that that if Obama is Harry Potter, like if he doesn't say Islamic terrorism, then the spell doesn't work, right? He has to say Islamic first. Otherwise, nothing he does actually works. The president's argument, of course, is that groups like ISIS base their legitimacy on this notion that they are representatives of all Muslims, that they are, the defense for every Muslim. And so therefore, referring to their actions as Islamic only sort of justifies that rhetoric. It legitimizes that viewpoint, and that's something that we don't want to do. It's a very good argument. But the notion that Islam and ISIS have nothing to do with each other is something that is absolutely contradicted by the other side of the argument, where it's not just that there's a relationship the two, it's that ISIS is Islamic, that's actually what it is, that Islam and ISIS are one and the same. And that if we could only just acknowledge that, then we could actually fight global terror much more effectively. The truth of the matter is that ISIS is Islamic because it says it's Islamic. A Muslim, by definition, is whoever says he's a Muslim. It's as simple as that. A Christian is whoever says he's a Christian. A Jew is whoever says he's a Jew. It's as simple as that. If you call yourself Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, you are those things. And there's nobody else that gets to tell you that you are or you aren't. That's not how this works. And so if ISIS defines itself as Muslim, if it says that it is acting out in the name of Islam, we should take that seriously. We should actually accept that self-designation. And I understand the desire among people of faith, communities of faith, to look at radicals in their midst, extremists in their midst, and to simply say, that's not us. That has nothing to do with us. I get that. It's just not very helpful, because continuing to pretend that these actions have no religious basis whatsoever makes it that much harder for us to actually confront, makes it that much harder for people within those religious communities to actually fight back against those radicals. If you just simply say, this is not our problem because they are not us, then you're not actually addressing the issue itself. At the same time, what does it actually mean for ISIS to declare itself to be Muslim? What does that actually say? What is the significance of that? After all, as most of you know, the vast majority of ISIS's victims, by the tens of thousands, are also Muslims. Oh, and by the way, the people on the ground, you know, the boots on the ground we keep talking about, who are fighting ISIS are Muslims. And the people who are actually writing in support of ISIS are Muslims. Oh, and the people who are writing against ISIS are Muslims. So if ISIS is Muslim, and their victims are Muslim, and the people fighting them are Muslim, what does that actually say about Islam? Does that actually say anything that we can make some sort of generalized comment about when it comes to Islam as a religion? And I think that's the question at hand here. What we are witnessing here is clearly an organization that is motivated by their own interpretation of Islam. And we could sit here and say that that interpretation, in which a few days ago an ISIS member publicly executed his own mother because she, for the crime of, and I quote, trying to talk him out of joining ISIS. If you look at an action like that, and the person who takes part in that action says, I am motivated by my religious belief to do something like this, it becomes very easy to look at scripture, to look at precedents, to look at Islamic law, to look at the almost universal normative interpretation of Islam and say that's not Islamic behavior. It's very easy to do that, but it's also not exactly correct. Because as much as we would like to say that is not Islamic behavior is whatever a Muslim says Islamic behavior is. When Bob Deere walked into a Planned Parenthood and shot the place up, he did it in the name of Christ. He said he was a Christian warrior trying to save babies. Now, as Christians, we would say, that's absurd. We could go through the scriptures, we could pick verse and chapter talking about how that is not proper Christian behavior. We can talk to 1,000 pastors, and they would all say, that is not proper Christian interpretation. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because the individual is the one who gets to define that for himself. And however horrific their actions are, we cannot just simply deny that, at least in their minds, there is a religious motivation for that action. So what do we do? Well, the dumb answer is to just simply say, well, then let's get rid of religion. Because, if we just do that, then we won't kill each other anymore. Did you know that? And all we got to do is get rid of religion, and violence will go away. This, of course, was the prevailing argument of the 20th century, right? We'll get richer and smarter and more developed, and we'll finally get rid of religion. And once we do that, then we'll live in peace and harmony. And what did we get? Fascism, socialism, Marxism, Maoism, Stalinism, Nazism, anti-religious ideologies responsible for the most horrific century in human existence, for the most bestial acts of violence in the history of humanity. Turns out we don't need God to kill each other. We'll just do it. So that's not the answer. That's not the answer. If you are a person of faith, as I am, as many of you are, then you have to recognize a fundamental truth, which is that the only answer to religious violence is religious peace. The only answer to religious hatred is religious love. The only answer to religious misogyny is religious feminism. The only answer to religious chauvinism is religious pluralism. That it is only we ourselves, those of us who are people of faith, who can fight back against those extreme, radical interpretations of our faith. But that involves not just rhetoric, it involves action. It's not just about coming up with a better argument. The better argument is easy. It's not that hard to simply find an argument against killing innocent people in the name of religion. That's not a hard thing. It's not a lot of sophistication involved in that. And in any case, it seems very difficult to imagine that that argument is going to make a difference to Bob Deere, that it's going to make a difference to a guy who thinks that he can execute his own mother. There is no argument for people like that. But they are not the intended audience for this argument. The intended audience is everybody else. It's the 40% of Americans who want a national registry of Muslims, of GOP supporters who want a national registry of Muslims. It's the 30% of Americans who want special IDs for Muslims. It's the nearly half of Americans who think that any minute they're going to be killed by a terrorist. That's who the argument has to be for. And that argument, as you've heard me say in this room half a dozen times, has to start with one fundamental truth, which is that data doesn't change minds. Data doesn't change minds. Information doesn't change people's minds. I would love to sit here and say, if I could just show these statistics to, Republicans and Trump supporters, then they'll change their minds. This is not about information. This is not about knowledge. Why? Because bigotry does not reside up here, right? Bigotry resides in here. Bigotry is not the result of a lack of information. Bigotry is a result of fear. And fear is impervious to data. Fear is impervious to information. I could tell my sons 1,000 times that there's nothing under their bed. We could turn the lights on and crawl under there, okay? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because this isn't what's driving that. This is. And the only thing that affects this is relationships. That's the only thing that affects this. Nearly half of Americans right now have a negative view of Islam. That's the highest that number has been since the immediate aftermath of 2001. And yet, what's really fascinating is that poll after poll has shown that if you know a single Muslim, if you know one Muslim, I don't mean your best friend is a Muslim. I mean, just like your neighbor or the grocer. If you know a single Muslim, it cuts in half your negativity rating. Why? Obvious. Because if you know a person as a person instead of as a symbol, then it becomes very hard to otherize that person. It becomes very hard to think of them as simply, a symbol of other. And so that puts an enormous burden, I think, on all of us, all of us people of faith, whether Christian or Jewish or Muslim or what have you. And for that matter, people who aren't of faith, people who actually believe in humanity and the goodness of the human species. That burden comes on us that we ourselves, every one of us, every individual has to become a representative of those values. Every single one of us has to fight back, not just with our words, but with our deliberate actions to create the kinds of bridges, to create the kinds of connections that have made the United States the most diverse country in the world. The first country, as demographers tell us, in about a decade, the first country in the world that will be majority minorities. That's a remarkable fact. It also scares the crap out of a lot of people. The same people who think that they're going to be killed by a terrorist any minute now. So my sort of call to all of us is that we recognize that the values that we hold as people of faith are values that have to be expressed in this world, now more than ever. That we have to be bold and loud with our values. That we have to make sure that the extremes don't speak for us, political extremes or religious extremes. And that the only way to do that is to raise our voices to the same pitch, to the same volume as the loud voices on the fringes. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. There we go. Thank you.
Perfect. Do you want to talk about your new religion project at all?
If anybody asks about it, sure, yeah.
Hold your hands up. We'll get a microphone to you. Here's one right here, right there. Less fast. Somebody on that side, right in the back. You see her? Thank you very much, please.
Hi. First, so good to see you again.
Thank you. It's
Thank
good
you
to see
so
guys.
much for being here again. Big fan. Two things struck me as I was listening to you. One is that it seems to me, as a gay person, a lot of our struggles seem to be exactly where you're sort of starting. And that is, one of the things we learned was that you don't change minds on a large scale. You change it one-to-one.
Mm-hmm.
You change it by coming out. You change it by getting into the streets, by being visible, all these things that you're talking about. And the other thing that I've been sort of toying with, especially since Iran and Saudi Arabia seem to be sharpening their knives, is that Islam seems to be preparing itself for its own reformation the same way that the Christians did a couple hundred years ago. But now, with so many weapons, a lot more bloody.
Yeah, that's true. Those are two excellent points. Your first one is one that I make all the time. In fact, I constantly use the LGBT experience in the United States as evidence for the proper way to defeat any kind of bigotry, whether it's racial or religious bigotry. Most of you are aware of how rapidly the pendulum swung in this country on the issue of same-sex marriage. I mean, even a decade ago, overwhelming majorities were against same-sex marriage. Today, majorities of Republicans, majorities of Christians in the United States actually support same-sex marriage. That's astounding. How did that happen? Is it because people read books about the LGBT experience? Is it because they took a course in biology? Is that what? No. Do you know how it happened? Will and grace. That's how it happened. Look, I'm being serious. I'm absolutely being serious. When Joe Biden made that point on Meet the Press, everybody made fun of him. Everybody said, "Oh, Joe, here he goes. Joe Biden again." Except he was 100% correct. Bigotry can only be tackled through relationships. It's only if you know someone who is LGBT that you can actually see them as a human being. But by our best estimates, that's what? 15% of the American public? Chances are, well, never mind, you live in Pasadena, so yeah, you know. What was I about? I was about to say something that was crazy, but of course we all know gay people. Of course we do. But many Americans don't. And so their first experience of a three-dimensional gay person a person who actually had like aspirations and challenges and was like a human being was what they saw on television. And I'm telling you, sociologists have written reams and reams on this topic, that pop culture is what changes people's minds, which is why I've been focusing so much now on using that same power to change people's minds of Middle Easterners and Muslims. Very quickly, let me just say on this issue of Reformation, you're right, except that I would say that Reformation has been going on for 100 years now. Understand that when we talk about Reformation, we are not talking about a positive or a negative thing. I think the Christian Reformation so often in the United States, first of all, it's referred to as the Protestant Reformation, right? As though it was a combat between, Protestant reform and Catholic intransigence, and by golly, the Protestants won, That's not what happened. Reformations are a universal phenomenon that take place in all great religious traditions, and they are simply a conflict between institutions and individuals over who has the authority to define the faith. And that's an ever-present experience. Now, in times of societal stress, that conflict rushes to the surface, and that's precisely what's been happening in the Middle East over the last 100 years. It's a long point. I won't get too much into it. Actually, I write a lot about this in No God But God, but what I would say is this, that I understand the impulse to look at the conflicts that are raging in the Middle East and to say, wow, these conflicts really point to the fact that Islam needs a reformation. Those conflicts are the Reformation. It's a bloody, chaotic thing. The Christian Reformation led to the death of half the population of Germany alone. Just Germany. These are extraordinarily bloody events, and this is the result of it. We're watching the result of the Reformation in Islam.
Questions right here, please.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for what you said. You basically said everything that I feel and need to hear more often, because I watch the news all the time and I just get the GOP crap all the time.
It's terrible.
But what I did want to say is I have a friend who, he's ignorant to a lot of these things, and I struggle sometimes because I get angry. I get passionate about it. And my question to you is, specifically in our relationships with people who aren't as open and aren't as accepting, what do you suggest how do we start the conversation with them? How do we get to the next level?
Well, what I would say is don't simply dismiss their fears, right? Don't just simply dismiss it as ignorance, because I think that's an impulse that we have to fight, right? That bigotry is a result of ignorance, as we've talked about, and it's not. But I do think that it's important to sort of tackle that fear by meeting them where they are, and more importantly, by allowing them to actually sort of confront that fear by confronting it very, very literally. In other words, I imagine, this person that you're talking about probably has no Muslim friends, right? So I think challenge him. Say, let's go hang out here. Let's go meet, some people. Why don't you ask this exact same question, that you're asking me of a Muslim? There are actually Muslims in Southern California. There's a lot of us, actually. But there's the Islamic Center on Vermont is a great place to start. Muslim for Progressive Values, MPV, Muslims for Progressive Values, is an amazing Los Angeles-based organization, and this is the kind of thing that they do. And again, I think that's the key, right? Is relationships. That's the key to transforming people's minds. You could probably give them all the information that you want to, and it won't make any difference.
Can you stand so he can see you?
Yes. And on the same note, in a sense, we are so grateful for your voice and for so many of the brilliant Muslim thought leaders that we have here, and the way they speak in a way that we all can relate to. But it seems that often in media, there are a lot of people speaking for Muslim issues that are not as perhaps media trained, effective, that they seem somewhat tone deaf about what people are hoping to hear that they will say. And of course, that doesn't mean they have to say those things, but still, you think about the lawyers for the San Bernardino family and people. So I'm just wondering if they're at this so critical moment where people are listening, if there's some sort of attempt to shape the voice in a more effective
There really
way.
is. It's a very good question, and there really is. There's actually a real concerted effort to provide precisely that kind of training, the media training, to allow people to actually represent themselves and their views in a way that I think is easily accessible to Americans. Now, what I will say is that it's a generational divide. You see some really fantastic spokespeople who are constantly on the news, constantly in the media, who are very good at speaking about these things, not because they've been trained, but because they grew up as consumers of the media. Nobody taught me how to speak to the media. I just watched like 9 hours of TV a day when I was a kid, and I was like, oh, that's just how you do it. And so that's very important, I think. But there is an institutional issue too, which is the media is predicated on, look, I have sat in a lot of editorial news board meetings, and I've also sat in a lot of writers' rooms, like television, dramas, writers' rooms. I can't tell the difference between the two. I really can't. They all ask the same question, what's the story? What's the narrative? Where's the drama? How do we get people to watch, right? That's all it's all about. How do we get people to watch? I mean, when you look at CNN or Fox or MSNBC, their sort of methodology is identical to the same methodology that ABC uses to get you to watch Scandal. It's the exact same thing, because they are both after the exact same thing, which is advertising dollars. That's all that matters. And so in order to do that, you have to, provide the same service, sex and violence and that's become, I think, sort of the problem of the 24-hour news cycle in particular. I recently got into a lot of trouble. I'm going to do this one last question, but I recently got into a lot of trouble about a week ago because I spoke off the cuff, and what I was trying to say was, hey, look, when you watch 24 hours of cable news, it's so awful that you'll want to kill yourself. And what I said, and this was a misspeak. This was absolutely, if there's any journalists here, please, this was a misspeak. What I said was, if you watch 24 hours of CNN, you'll probably kill yourself. And the problem is that I have a show on CNN. And I got a very angry email from CNN. And so that's not what I meant, and I just want to kind of emphasize that's not what I meant. I meant just cable news, any kind of cable news. If you watch 24 hours of MSNBC or you watch 24 hours of Fox. Actually, if you watch 24 hours of Fox News, you probably want to kill someone else. Probably a Mexican or a Muslim, actually.
Randy, last question.
Reza, thank you so much. You were spot on as far as relationships. And I just wanted to make a point because I know John Hyde is not here today. This afternoon at 5 p.m., we're all going to be gathering at the Vermont Center, the Islamic Center on South Vermont. It's our interfaith study group where we'll be having Muslims, Jews, and Christians together. We're going to be talking about poetry tonight, and you're all welcome to come.
Fantastic. That's great.
Brent, raise your hand. Go ahead, Brent. Say it, and he'll get to you.
I'll hear you.
He'll repeat it.
I'm wondering about, in thinking about the ways that you've engaged publicly in the media, and in particular, perhaps the various debates you've engaged with somebody like Sam Harris. Those have been really effective. I mean, you should keep doing those because you're really good at them, and they've been very helpful for me. Not so much in how to effectively win an argument, but rather. Thank you. Rather, how to be in relationship, right? How to be in relationship with someone who has very diametrically opposed viewpoints. And I wonder if, so in relationship, and a number of people have asked about this idea of relationship, being in relationship, and relationships are messy, if you have, through this like, admittedly kind of theatricalized way of kind of engaging with these folks, if you've been reflective in the ways that those things have changed you, right? Like in relationship, it's not just about talking to somebody,
Right.
but rather listening and stuff. Have you been reflective of that at all? In
Yes.
Your own?
In fact, I'll be honest with you. So 10 years ago, when I would have these conversations, I would always begin by first saying, these actions don't reflect Islam. These people are not Muslim. That same argument that I just contradicted, 20 minutes ago. Because I realized, A, it's not true, and B, that immediately closes the door on the conversation. If you're not willing to, at the very least, acknowledge somebody else's fear, somebody else's concerns, then there's no room for a conversation. If you're immediately saying, this is a dumb argument because your entire point is wrong, that conversation ends. The last thing that I'll just say, because I know we all have to go to church, including me, which is, I'll just use this, and I've used this example in this room before, which is that I don't think that we should simply, sweep away the differences. Those differences are real, they exist for a reason, and we should celebrate those differences, the way that we think differently as Muslims versus as Christians or what have you. But I'm in an interfaith marriage. My wife is Christian. I'm Muslim. And people constantly ask us, how does that actually work? And we just laugh about it, because the truth of the matter is while we have different languages, different symbols, different metaphors, the values that we share are almost identical. That's true, I think, across the board for all of us. And so my argument, whether you're talking to an atheist or whether you're talking to someone of a different religion, is don't ignore those differences. They're fine. Don't try to, sweep them onto the rug. But instead of focusing on the way in which you describe your values, focus on the values. Just focus on the values. Forget about, interfaith dialogue shouldn't be interfaith dialogue. It should be values dialogue. We all feel the same way. We all share similar sentiments and ideas about how we want to live, how we want our kids to live, the world that we want to live in. Just focus on that. And who cares whether the metaphor that you use is different? That's interesting, but I think that the important thing is to understand what the metaphor stands for, not the metaphor itself. Amen. Okay? Thanks, everybody.
Are you going to church? Did you say
Yeah.
you're going to